And finally, let's talk about this incident in Peckham. A video has gone viral, essentially showing an Asian shopkeeper allegedly manhandling a black woman. And it's kind of been seized upon as a racist incident. So there have been protests outside the shop. Many of the sort of race equality charities have got involved. I mean, Tom, I know it's early days and it's probably a bit too early to say, we can't even say what happened really. But, what have you made of the reaction to it?
Yeah, well, it's difficult because on the one hand, there is this video which is naturally going to upset people. So you've got a shopkeeper, an Asian gentleman, manhandling, as you say, a woman who's about 30 years old. It seems like going on the reporting, this is somewhere between a bust up over a refund through to, as was alleged on the other side, a kind of case of shoplifting that she came in. She wanted a refund. She was denied it. She was alleged to then try to basically just take what she felt she was owed, and then he tries to stop her from leaving. At one point, is seen putting a hand around her throat, and then that's going to put anyone's nose out of joint. That's going to concern anyone. But at the same time, the question of what really went on here is never obvious from a bit of CCTV footage or from a bit of, camera phone footage.
Yeah.
Very quickly, a very crude and simplistic racial narrative was imposed upon this, which I think we should take very seriously and be very concerned about, which is to say that this was, as you say, instantly a racist incident without anyone stopping to wonder or check whether or not there's any evidence to suggest racial animus plays a role here, rather than someone overreacting or reacting poorly to a particular situation. It has also taken on a new grim dimension insofar as the racial dynamics have become quite pronounced. A lot of the protests talking about, we don't do this to your women, why do you do it to our women? Signs left on the shutters of the shop, which hasn't been able to open for a number of days now, referring to them as parasitic merchants. Constant talk about you people, i.e. South Asians, effectively running these businesses in our community. You're starting to see this kind of really grim identity politics being imposed upon it. And also this being done quite explicitly by not just race equality charities, but also various groups which kind of range from wannabe black nationalists to sort of identitarian groups. I mean, Ngozi Fulani, if anyone remembers her from the Lady Hussey microaggressions scandal, was there addressing the crowd there. Forever Family, who people might remember from 2020, which is a slightly confusing group. No one really knows what it is actually that they do, but gentlemen who walk around in kind of stab vests, seemingly to kind of evoke a kind of black nationalist kind of paramilitary vibe, who again were out there making their presence felt. It's taken on a pretty grim kind of racial tone, and there has been this rush to judgment, which I think takes us into a territory that we really don't want to go into, something that happens in America, which essentially, based on the identity of the alleged perpetrator or the identity of the alleged victim, no one stops to work out what actually happened. They just impose this crude racial script on it and then let rip. And I think we're seeing that repeated here, and we really don't want to see that start to become a feature of life in diverse modern Britain, as it were.
Yeah, Candice, I wanted to ask you in particular about the sort of rush to judgment aspect. That has been quite worrying.
Yes, what Tom said, all of it, totally. That's the way I see it. So, it's worrying because it's actually very dehumanizing. Instead of seeing just human beings, people who could just be making terrible decisions in the heat of the moment, clashing personalities, just things that are quite ordinary. We see people playing out grand narratives, grand racial narratives, grand political narratives. And there is something very particular to our social media age in which people do that. Obviously, it's a big American phenomenon. As Tom said, you look at the woman, the city bike Karen. Yeah. And there was, oh my gosh, there was so much discussion about whether she was in the wrong or whether she was in the right. And no one could accept, maybe on both sides there was a bit of confusion, not understanding each other properly, a bit of bad temper.
This was a woman who got upset at someone taking a bike that she'd hired.
Yes. Yeah. And but the boys on the other side said, no, it was my bike and I was just recharging it. And, we'll never know whether there was... One thing I objected to is people tried to make her either all good or all bad, or the boy is all good or all bad. There was just no room for just nuance. You know what? People sometimes have really bad disagreements with each other and do stupid things, and it's just as simple as that.
And Tom, in terms of the sort of the racial dynamic here, it's interesting. You've had some people come out and say, particularly on Twitter and on videos and things like that, saying that white supremacy is to blame, when really there's no white people involved as far as I can tell.
No, exactly. And I think it's a reminder that this identity politics, this victim politics, some of which is being pushed very explicitly by some of the campaigners in and around this case, but also it's just sort of in the air, it's in the water, isn't it, at the moment, is such a big problem if you want to live in a genuinely kind of diverse society, if you will. Because this isn't just about, by pushing a kind of politics of racial victimhood, by pushing a politics of racial division, by encouraging people to see every interaction, good, bad, and in between, as an expression of some sort of racial dynamic, unconscious biases, and so on. It's not just bad because it means white people occasionally have to feel uncomfortable, or they're going to be accused of racism here or there and boo-hoo about that. It's really going to become a big problem in terms of creating or exacerbating pre-existing frictions between ethnic minority groups themselves. This is one thing that often isn't really talked about in the question of race relations and anti-racism. But as Rakib Hassan, Spike Collins, has made this point in another outlet about how when ethnic minorities were in polls, there was a Hope Not Hate report a couple of years ago, a plurality of them will say, as in more say than not, that the tensions between ethnic minorities is more stark than it is between ethnic minorities and white people, for instance. And that's something which, again, if we continue to push this politics of victimhood, if we continue to push this idea that we all belong to these kinds of groups and that whenever some sort of incident happens, we have to rally back to our side, you're going to stoke up potentially ethnic conflict. I don't mean that in a violent sense necessarily, but certainly a lot of animosity, as we've seen on the streets of South London this week. Which is not about which won't necessarily even involve white people. This isn't about tears for the white majority, and they're sorry a lot in this. This is about the fact that the more you kind of balkanise society, the more tension you store up. And I just think it's so clear we're starting to go down that road, very much influenced by America. And we need to stop, because it's something which, as soon as you adopt that lens of society, it's very difficult to kind of push it away and go back to kind of seeing yourselves as citizens again, if you see what I mean.